Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Scientific Conferencing Workshop, Track 4, Session 1, focused on balancing participant needs and technology for engaging conferences and meetings. My name is Dr. Kara Hall, and I'm a health scientist administrator at the National Cancer Institute at NIH, and also a member of the planning committee for this workshop. So I'll be moderating this session focused on building bridges, navigating diverse viewpoints and needs to optimize the conference experience. In this session, we'll hear a brief presentation from each of the speakers, followed by comments from our invited discussant. Following these remarks, we'll engage in a group moderated discussion, including questions submitted from the audience. So please use the Q&A function and to submit your questions for the speakers to me. And you can also use the chat function to have conversation and make observations and thoughts to the other audience members. So I'm pleased to introduce the speakers for this session. The first speaker will be Jessica Pokharel, Manager of Research and Discovery at ITHAKA, followed by Dr. Willem Standaert, Associate Professor at HEC Liège in the Management School of the University of Liège. Lauren Kuehne, Independent Consultant of Omfishient Consulting, and Nancy Kidd, former Executive Director of the American Sociological Association and the National Communication Association. So now let's begin with our first presentation by Jessica Pokharel.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about financial models for virtual and hybrid meetings. First, let me tell you, if you're not familiar with the organization that I'm from, it is ITHAKA, a not-for-profit that's about equitable access to knowledge, scholarly communication, and publishing. You may be familiar with our primary offering, which is JSTOR, a large journal database, but primarily focused in the humanities and social sciences. So not that much overlap with the world of NIH, at least for JSTOR, but ITHAKA as a whole is related to all disciplines. A colleague and I did a couple of research projects in 2022 and 2023 about the future of the scholarly meeting. And this was related to, things have changed during COVID. The Scholarly Society having a single large yearly meeting in person seemed like needed to be reevaluated. So we did a couple of different types of research that I'd like to walk you through with a focus on both the models for meetings and the finances attached to that. We came up with a taxonomy of models that we were seeing. Of course, there's the traditional fully in-person meeting, which is expensive. Sometimes we heard it was as much of, that might be half of the yearly budget of a society, for instance, was putting on the conference. But of course, that's where a lot of their revenue comes from as well. The hybrid meeting, which was gaining some steam in 2022 and 2023 as people were beginning to meet in person again, but also seeing that there were those who couldn't travel or didn't want to travel, and they understood that it was more accessible for the meeting to have it available both ways, virtually and in person. But the main thing we were hearing about that one was the expense being so large, because you have to have all the tech worked out for the streaming, but you also have to have all the in-person accommodations. And it was seeming really like that one was going to be financially difficult to sustain. So some emerging models that we were seeing that are maybe less well known. One was a hub and spoke, where in there is an in-person conference, and one society in particular was having success with this because there would be, let's say, a student chapter of their society at one school would kind of self-organize and host a watch party. So this could perhaps even be called watch parties, remote watch parties. But that was working out pretty well for the societies because of being able to kind of offload organization to different regions. Distributed is related to that, but in this case, there's not a central hub. It's spokes only where different events are taking place and then being shared virtually. We didn't hear a lot of this. Some societies were saying we'll do 1 year of virtual and 1 year of in-person and alternate that way as a way to both manage costs and increase participation for people who can't travel in person. But this is another way to do that, which would be that each year the conference is both virtual and hybrid with different events happening at overlapping times. 2 more, just that we heard people were experimenting with, taking advantage of. One is a multidisciplinary topical summit. And in fact, that you might say that's what's going on right now with this, because I don't typically work in the field of health or hard sciences, but this is, the emerging model of what a meeting is and can be and should be, crosses all disciplines. So to some extent, that's what's going on here. But they found it a way to share costs across multiple societies. If you find a single topic of interest that multiple societies can bring members to, then they're able to share the cost. And this is kind of a scaled down version of the multidisciplinary summit, but it's more likely to be an in-person meeting with a single focus. Just some other notes about this. I have a quote here from an executive director of a society who is saying travel costs are out of control and unsustainable for members, particularly with the cost of conferences increasing, funding from schools being in jeopardy, staff having contingent appointments at the university and not getting travel paid. There were a lot of pieces coming together to make the traditional in-person conference just more difficult to pull off financially. I heard from one director of a very small society who had stopped hosting their own meetings entirely and kind of just tag along, have a meeting here and there at other large conferences. So that's one way to, for a certain type of society, to skip the question entirely of how to fund their meeting. Another interesting thing we were starting to see is if you're doing a hybrid conference, or even if you're just doing an in-person one where the sessions are recorded, societies have found some success in monetizing the recordings from the conference. So that might take a couple of different forms. It might mean that they are giving that video access as a benefit of membership, so that more people are enticed to become members of the society. It might be that they're directly selling access to those videos separate from membership. So that was kind of some of the qualitative stuff that we heard. I'd like to also give you a sense of the scale and the ranges of numbers that we were getting in terms of how much a conference costs or whether virtual is included in it. So we found 89 societies that had this information publicly available. I will say that most of them are in STEM. I believe it was about 85% STEM and 15% humanities and social sciences. And this is what we found for membership dues. There's a very, very high end here. A lot of these the very expensive ones were things like oncologist conferences. And no surprise that some of the cheapest ones were often the humanities and social sciences conferences. It was interesting that I don't have this represented in the graph, but there were a few different axes on which the societies were offering different options. So one might be some societies had a sliding scale based on either how much income you had or where you were in your career, as in student versus 5 years or less as a working professional versus seasoned professional. Some of them had different costs based on where you lived geographically. So they weren't. It wasn't even as simple as this is how much it costs to be a member of the society. There were increasing diversity in types of discounts or upcharges. To go to the annual in-person meeting, these are the costs here, a maximum of almost $900. And finally, we separated out, for some societies, out of this 89, there were 29 societies that offered an option to pay to attend the virtual meeting only. In most cases, excuse me, I want to go back 2 slides. In most cases, this included the virtual conference as well, if there was one, or if it was a hybrid conference, this included both. But there were a few instances where they had a virtual only meeting and this was the fee. And as you can see, these are considerably less expensive. It has been the case across the board that attending a virtual conference comes out to be less than an in-person conference. So those are some of the thoughts I have. I will, again, note that these data are a year or 2 behind, and it certainly seems like a space where societies are in the midst of figuring things out post-COVID. So in some cases, they don't yet know what the financial effects of are for having, 2 years of virtual conference in a row. So it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on the space. And I will pass it to the next presenter.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Willem Standaert. I'm an associate professor at HEC Liège, as already introduced, and I'm going to be talking about meetings. Now, when I talk about meetings, I actually refer to the smaller scale, so not the big conferences per se, but rather a meeting of, let's say, 5 to 10 people, which is actually the thing we all know and also love to hate, which means actually we know they are necessary because it's where some work gets done, some buy-in of the participants is generated. However, we also know that they consume quite some time and energy, which is why we sometimes also dislike them. Now, face-to-face meetings have been the default for many years, or decades even, you could say. But things changed quite suddenly a couple of years ago with COVID. So we were suddenly virtual, meaning we had to work from home in large parts of the world, and virtual meetings became the hallmark of that work from home. What you see here is a picture of me doing video conferencing with my Ph.D. supervisors, as I did my work at Kent University on the subject of virtual meetings, even before the pandemic. Now, back to the pandemic, actually, what we see is that there is a permanent shift, meaning that virtual meetings have become more accepted and therefore more used, also for many meetings that before were held face-to-face. We also noticed that there has been this, stark interest into well-being. More precisely, a lot of people were talking about Zoom fatigue or video conferencing fatigue, and so that's an important consideration. Now, all in all, what's key is that also in recruitment of employees is that you offer them a nice suite of collaboration tools. And so virtual meetings being one of them, but of course also giving them nice facilities to also come to the office to have in-person meetings from time to time. And finally, what we saw during COVID is that more generally, because meetings were so much in the forefront, a lot of meeting practices were reconsidered. And of course, one key one that had to be considered is how to meet. So how shall we meet? That's the topic of this presentation. And of course, what I should highlight is that the virtual meeting is not just one format. There's actually a range of possibilities. So let me walk you through those. So in addition to video conferencing, what we are kind of having right now, where you can see each other, at least we see talking heads and we can share a screen. There's also audio conferencing, in which you only hear each other, and in which actually there's a lot of possibility for confusion, as the bingo is getting at on the left-hand side. I'm sure you've heard many of these phrases if you were in an audio conferencing meeting. Then let me move on to the other end of the spectrum of virtual meeting modes, which is something called telepresence. So telepresence has been around also for more than a decade, and it is a technology where you see each other in true life size. There is directional audio, and as you can see in the picture, the furniture is the same, and the table seems to continue at the other end. So what you see here, the people in the back are actually remote. And so you actually have this immersive feeling where you forget that you're not physically together. And if you were talking about capabilities here, what's missing is just the ability to have physical contact, like shaking hands. So if I now put these different possibilities on a range or on a figure, I discuss the capabilities, which is on the horizontal axis. But important to note is that there's also a difference in cost. The difference in costs correlates with the capabilities, except for face-to-face, where it depends on the location of the participants. So a meeting can be a face-to-face meeting in person can be very low cost if people are in the same office. However, if it requires travel, it can have a very high cost. And for the others, it kind of depends on the bandwidth that you need and the investment in equipment that you need. And so I hope from this figure, it's clear that the decision of how to meet is non-trivial. So since I am a meeting scientist, of course, I look at the literature, and what the literature tells us is that how people should be making a choice. Well, there's different factors that you can take into account, like the cost, access, urgency of the matter. However, what is key is to consider the objective of the meeting as the dominant driver of the choice of the modality. Meeting mode effectiveness, that is what we are interested in, is the ability to meet your objectives as well as possible. And this actually, according to the theories, follows from matching the capabilities of the mode with the requirements of the objectives. So that will become a bit more concrete in a minute. The supporting theories you can see there. However, I will not spend more time on those. Moving on to the next slide, here's where you see our decision logic now. So the decision was how to meet, but actually we say, well, first you need to consider why are you meeting? And then what comes in between, so to bring the two together, is the capabilities, right? The capabilities that are offered by the mode and that are required for the objective. So I start from the left-hand side. Why do you meet? So in the literature, there was not a list readily available in terms of why do people meet. So we developed this list based on literature and some qualitative research. And so you see, we come up with a list of 19 objectives across that we bundled into 4 groups. And throughout our research of multiple years, we found this list to be quite, consistent and comprehensive. So what we have now is on the left hand, those objectives, on the right hand, the meeting modalities. So what's missing in the middle is the capabilities that are on the one hand important for the objective and at the same time offered by the capabilities. So you see the list there. This comes from a longer list, which was again validated through research. So the ones that are listed is half of the total. Those are the ones that are really important, and I will go over them in one of the next slides. Just to tell you that we did multiple studies across multiple companies, right? So to make sure that this is some patterns are kind of generalizable. We used pseudonyms here, but you can see all 3 organizations where we did the research are very large in terms of the number of employees and very widespread, so very much global companies. So those at the time, of course, we purposely looked for because they were the ones already adopting virtual meetings to a large extent. And so in total, across the companies, we gathered data on over 2,000 real-life business meetings. So it was the actual participants of those meetings that responded to our surveys. Here's one of the key findings, a little bit simplified, but you see the objectives bundled on the left-hand side and the capabilities on the right-hand side. So what this graph or figure tells us is that for the first set of objectives about exchanging information, you only need 2 capabilities. It's important to hear each other, so the first one on the right, and you need to be able to share a computer screen. And that's it, right? So you could say, you can do without video here, right? Indeed, because it's not a capability that is found to be important. Moving on, however, making decisions is where the same 2 capabilities of before are important, and a new one is added with it, which is seeing body language. So there you would start needing video conferencing. If your meeting involves communicating sentiments, the past 3 capabilities are important, plus yet another one, which is discerning or seeing facial expressions. And then for the final set, for building relationships, all 4 previous capabilities are important, in addition to experiencing co-location, so feeling that you are somewhere together, and the ability to see what the others are doing or looking at. So this is, of course, a key takeaway, but we wanted to triangle this finding with observations about meeting effectiveness. So what you see on this slide then is, of course, a lot of graphs, so it's a little bit convoluted, but you see the different modalities: audio conferencing, video conferencing, telepresence, face-to-face, and you see the effectiveness score for different objectives. I just want to show or highlight that there seems to be a positive kind of trend. So going from audio conferencing over video, telepresence, face-to-face, generally it seems the effectiveness increases, which makes sense because I just told you that for most objectives, as you go over the objectives, you need more capabilities. However, there are exceptions, and so I just want to highlight the light blue line here, which is routine exchange of information, where the effectiveness seems to go down as you go over these different modalities, which is actually signaling that less can be more. So in this case, our explanation is, well, you just need to be able to hear each other and look at some shared screen. And if you add video, it might actually be more a distraction than something that adds to the effectiveness. To make the model a little bit more complex, but also complete, we also looked at the duration of the meeting and the meeting size, or how many participants do you have, which in our model moderate the relationships between the objectives and the capabilities required. And so again, I'm showing you a bit of simplified findings, but basically what it boils down to is that for short and small meetings, you can keep with what I told you before. So audio conferencing and the ability to hear each other and use a shared screen is sufficient if it's just short and small for exchanging information. However, if your meeting becomes long and or large, you need more capabilities. And that's a trend we kind of see throughout, with some exceptions, that as you meet with more people or have longer meetings, more capabilities become important, and therefore you need a higher end meeting mode. So what are the key takeaways that I hope you start applying into your meeting mode decisions? Is that, first of all, virtual meetings can be an effective alternative for face-to-face meetings. So it depends on the objectives. So those should drive the decision to make to select a meeting modality. Also, be very conscious that as you invite more people and choose for a longer duration, actually be conscious that this has an impact on the modalities that are important to be effective in the meeting. And finally, just a small note is what you can do as a best practice is to actually use your capabilities dynamically, which again, we are doing in terms of muting our audio and video if we're not speaking in this call. But however, also you can think of various collaboration tools, polling, shared screens. When is it important to see, let's say, the boss in the big picture? All those things can be nicely configured in the technologies that we have nowadays. However, what you can also do, of course, is say we split up the meeting depending on the objective, and we change the modality within the same group depending on what we are trying to achieve. Typically, you would have like monthly status updates or weekly status updates, for instance, and then monthly or yearly face-to-face meetings, which will be more about relationship building objectives. So if you want to read more and find all the detailed data about what I just presented, I'm happy to share this paper with you, which was co-authored with my PhD supervisor, Steve Meule and Amit Basu. With that, I hand over to the next speaker.
Okay, well, good day, everyone. I have to, okay. So I'm very, very pleased to be here, and the presentations that preceded mine, I have so many questions for my co-presenters, and I am just really engaged in the work that they're doing is wonderful, and hopefully you'll see the connections between that and mine. So my name is Lauren Kuehne, and I am, I guess I should change to my actual slide presentation. And I am presenting on behalf of my team. We'll have a team slide soon. It is kind of a larger team, and we're not hierarchical in any way, so I'm not really the face of it. I just, oops, as someone said. Oh, okay, sorry, I got a little message. So yeah, I'm the person that was available today, but we are very much a dynamic group, a larger group that work in ecology and conservation. Our project is called EcoDive, and our acronym is, based on this: Evaluating Conferences for Diverse Engagement. You'll see this throughout the entire presentation, but when we talk about diversity, we took a slightly different track. We're talking about organizational diversity. And so in our field, many ecologists and scientists work in tribes, organizations, nonprofits, consulting agencies, government, and of course, academia. And so our emphasis on diversity looked at how our conference is serving scientists that work in these diverse types of organizations. So this presentation, I want to say this is the first time that I have presented on this project where we're presenting anything that looks like preliminary data. So hopefully you can understand that we're at the very beginning stages of this project. But it has three parts. I want to talk about our focus on the environmental sciences. I am an ecologist, and how this came from our cultural norms in some ways, and our history of the environmental sciences and what we call the social contract, in how profoundly that has shaped, for many scientists, our field. Now, of course, the pandemic went and changed a lot of the modalities of how we became collaborating and meeting. So I'll talk a little bit about that, of course, and then how that led to our EcoDive project to understand how does conferences in general, and then conference modality, facilitate or potentially limit organizational access, collaboration, and diversity and participation. So a little bit about the environmental sciences and what's called the social contract. There were many movements within our field, but basically one of the most profound was led, I think, by a scientist called, her name is Jane Lubchenco. She's a brilliant scientist, the former head of NOAA. And climate change has had, I cannot overstate the profound impact that climate change has had on our field. We study organisms that are moving, things are changing within our lifetime, the impact. And I think that for many environmental scientists, that created an opening for Dr. Lubchenco and others to call for stronger engagement of researchers with societal issues. Now, when she published this paper in 1998, there was a lot of pushback. Scientists said, my role is to do science, not to engage, with policy and advocacy and, to do all of these things. But, it's been a lot of time, and many in our field have taken this to heart. And the aspects of what that looks like is that we direct our efforts to pressing societal impact issues, engage deeply, authentically, and with those working outside of academia. And part of that is in order to communicate that research to the public to facilitate decision and policy making. And there has been a lot of progress in our field, but in 2020, Dr. Lubchenco and a colleague wrote an update to this, and they said, yes, there has been movement, but they're still calling for, they said we still need a quantum leap in engagement. And they actually call out the culture of academia. This is a literal quote, to call out the culture of academia to engage more deeply and to serve society better. So this is a big movement within the environmental sciences. And so when we entered the pandemic and altered our modes of conferences and collaboration. Now, you've seen in many, Dr. Sarah presented on the first day of the conference, and others have presented on, the pandemic altered our collaboration, and all of a sudden we saw increased global participation. We saw increased diversity of participants. We know all of these things, and they have been documented in hard numbers now. And of course, we saw dramatically increased sustainability of our conferences. This is so in our field, me and some colleagues, we engaged, put in some, created some opinion articles. But overall, I think that the idea was that, for environmental and natural resource scientists, virtual conferences and hybrid conferences were a no-brainer. They checked off all of these boxes. Sorry, these are supposed to be check marks. They didn't quite translate. These are not supposed to be question marks. It's supposed to be a checkbox next to all of these things here. So check the boxes of sustainability. Our field is global, and we have an actual poor history of doing helicopter science and working in biodiverse places, often in the global south, and then exporting that knowledge to the wealthier countries. So this seemed like an opportunity to try and even that out. Checked off all of these things, and we thought, this is something that our field and our disciplines will embrace. And many people did, but we found that there was really also not a rush to necessarily embrace these new modalities. And while people acknowledged the changes, they also were really just wanted to meet in person again. And for us, again, as environmental scientists working in our field, I think that we expected a much stronger engagement and a much stronger discourse around than what we saw happening. So that led to us to submit a proposal to the National Science Foundation to say, this is an important issue for engagement and collaboration. And we focused on, again, organizational diversity. So this is our whole project team. It's quite large and diverse. And we have a PI team, but we also have a steering committee that participates heavily, which is made up of 4 professional societies. And then we have a project evaluator who works with our advisory board. But the basic thrust is that it's a combination. We have tried to bring together the expertise of ecology and conservation and environmental researchers working in different, nonprofits and government. And I'm an independent consultant and industry, and of course, academia. And then also the expertise of professional societies. So for example, many of the things that Jessica talked about, these constraints that professional societies have, we wanted to try and understand and integrate those into our work. So this is our project team, and we have a website where everybody's listed if you want more information about them. Our research questions are threefold. This is an evaluation grant. So when we pitched this, we said, this is a new landscape. We really don't understand exactly what is going on with all of these. There's a lot of moving parts. So we want to come in and just really understand and evaluate. So our first, these are supposed to be 1, 2, 3. They're 1, 1, 1, but it's supposed to be 1, 2, 3. So sorry about that. But basically, we want to analyze past data sets. Did virtual conferences facilitate access for more organizations? And then we wanted to understand what are the factors that play into that. Is it access? Is it logistics? Is it funding? Is it the feeling of being welcome or belonging? And then the third one is to think future looking and say, well, how do we design future conferences that serve these diverse organizations and also early career, maybe not early career, but researchers across career stage. And our 3 research questions have 3 tasks, which is the first one, we're analyzing past conference attendance data. This is in process. We have, data over about 7-year period from, multiple professional societies. It's messy data. It's not perfect data, but we do have that to work with. And then our task 2, we're in the process of working up a survey where we want to survey both people in our field that attend conferences regularly, but also do not attend conferences regularly. So we're trying to understand that full landscape. And then thirdly, we have focus groups. That'll be next year, where we start to ask the question of how do we, what would we design for the future that might promote that access. So I have a few small results that we're starting to look at and starting to contemplate. And then also I want to talk about our survey as well. So this is the data from one of our professional societies, which is the Ecological Society of America. And in it, we have assessed the organizational makeup of conference attendees over a 7-year period. And you can see here we have on the x-axis, we have time, and then the count of participants. And then we have classified them based on these broad categories of, are they a government agency, an organization, org is a nonprofit. And then are they academic, and then could we not classify them? And then we're going to be looking at more ways to classify them in more granular ways by we can actually look at the type of academic institution, the type of government agency. But for now, it's at this coarser level. So, there's a lot of edu.edu. It's mostly academic, and I think even more strongly than we expected. Even though we go to these conferences, we know what the makeup looks like, but I think we were surprised. And we saw a little shift during the pandemic. We see that maybe there was some opening, but we also saw greater participation overall. So we're trying to figure out how important that shift was. It wasn't as large as I think we were hoping or expecting. So that's one part of it, is that we're looking at conferences that seem to be very largely dominated by academic institutions. And then the next one was to assess, well, how many, at any given conference, how likely is that person to be a repeat? And this is over a 7-year period. So for the most part, people are one-time conference goers. And that gave us a really interesting and different picture of a conference. It's not a kind of community. Well, it does, at least this indicates that it's not necessarily a community. It's much more of an evolving community where people are dropping in and out, or maybe going once and seeing if it's for them. So this has given us some new information to contemplate. And we're continuing this process of analyzing these data in this way. And then the next part of our task 2, is to survey conference attendees and non-attendees. And for that, the way that we're doing that is we're doing systematic data mining in a random sample of states to identify professionals across organizational types. So, in academic institutions, but also in government, nonprofits, consultant, and tribal organizations. We've completed that, for 12 of our states, and we're working toward 25. And we have identified thousands of environmental scientists, this is pretty eye-opening. We have people working in academic communities are not the minority, but they are certainly not, they are one of many organization types that are represented. And so, it's not, you don't have to do fancy statistics to say, wow, well, the figure on the left-hand side really does not look like the figure on the right-hand side. And I personally, I'm an independent consultant. I come from a background of academia, but the most of the people that I work with are nonprofits, tribes, government scientists. And so this graph on the right does not surprise me. The graph on the left surprised me a little bit. I thought that it was a more proportionate, but we'll keep working on these analysis. But the take home is kind of that we have some groups that may be disproportionately represented, and then we have some groups which really are basically unrepresented when we go to a conference. And for that, in survey, so our next steps is that we're putting out this survey, and we will ask all of these scientists through this systematic data mining process. We hope to get good representation across all of these groups, and we want to understand, what is the preferences? Do you attend? Do you not attend? Why do you not attend? To try and start to tease apart what is the reasoning for this. And we have some ideas about it already, but obviously we want to hear from respondents. So hopefully I'm not going to, I think this is my last slide. Yes, this is my last slide. So, well, I have one more. But the implications that are sort of emerging for us and for especially the fields of ecology and conservation is that if conferences are going to continue to be places that are dominated by academic, conference goers, that's fine. It's just that we need to put that in context. So if someone is going there to seek new ideas and research, well, they need to understand that they're looking at one set of ideas. If they're going there to find collaborators, they need to understand that they're going there and going to encounter one type of collaborator for the most part. So I think that we need to, there's a lot of assumptions that are made about conferences and how that works into networking and collaboration and inspiration for new ideas. And I think that, some of the implications are emerging is that we need to be realistic about what conferences are, especially, and then, maybe what they're not. And so currently, this is a big issue in ecology and conservation. Most scientists do not work in academia, but if they go to a conference, they're not going to encounter people working for the most part in those career paths. And that's known, actually pretty well known in our field. And then the next question is things that we're going to be continuing to work on is, do virtual and hybrid alternatives, do they open that up? Do they, make that a point of access for more diverse organizational types to participate? And so we're going to be continuing to work through that in the next stages of our process. So you can follow along. We are early in our work, and it's going to be continuing to evolve. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to present at this stage. So thank you.
Hi, now we're going to have a chance to hear from Dr. Nancy Kidd, and her comments and reactions. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nancy Kidd. Thanks very much to my colleagues for very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. In this session, we're talking about how to navigate diverse viewpoints and needs to optimize the conference experience. And what I'm hearing is that there's really not a single answer to that question. Willem points to the need to evaluate what you're trying to accomplish and then determine modality accordingly. And I think we can build from there with the other presentations and considering an even wider range of variables and determining what kinds of meetings make sense in different contexts. Jessica brings cost into the model, for example, and Lauren brings environmental considerations. And Lauren raised an interesting question near the end of her presentation when she was saying, maybe it's okay if the conference doesn't serve everybody. And that's a question we should think about. But if we do want to meet the needs and perspectives of all, or at least the vast majority of constituents, and again, Lauren mentioned, maybe going into different areas or types of conferencing might do that, then we need to think about providing a range of options. So maybe we have to think about developing a package of possibilities that hopefully will resonate with multiple constituencies, but from which all constituents can find at least some satisfaction. To do this, as our panelists made clear, we have to identify the primary variables that affect what kind of conferencing works for different people. So there are preferences, of course. Some people just like to be with other people in person. Others prefer to avoid social interaction, just get to the scientific material in a virtual setting. There are resource constraints, especially at a time when employers are cutting back on conference funding. And there are other kinds of constraints like health or disability and family responsibilities. And certainly environmental considerations factor in, with some people weighing them more heavily than others. You can all easily come up with a list of variables. And as we weigh attendee preferences and needs, we can't forget that not all options are viable from an organizational perspective. So as Jessica said, for example, true hybrid models are prohibitively expensive for most organizations. So once we make a full list of variables to map onto different meeting approaches, we see that this is actually a pretty complex calculation. So I'd like to share with you just very briefly what the American Sociological Association did in this regard as an illustrative example. I worked on this as the executive director at the time with a wonderful group of members and staff who served on what we called the Annual Meeting Redesign Committee. This group was charged with reimagining our annual conference with respect to both meeting delivery and distribution of time and space. And I see both of these components as interrelated and crucial to these discussions, adding yet another layer of complexity. So the committee collected a lot of original data. We did a member survey. As Lauren was talking about, we looked at people who attended meetings, people who didn't attend meetings. We did a carbon analysis. We used some existing data for analysis. It was a pretty large research project. The association's board approved all of the committee's recommendations, and I'm going to mention here just a couple. Turning first to distribution of time and space, we learned from the member survey that research-oriented sessions are of paramount importance to conference goers, irrespective of modality. So several of our recommendations were about focusing the larger annual conference primarily on intellectual content and moving other activities that had typically been part of the conference out to smaller, more specialized virtual sessions that were held throughout the year. This included things like mentoring activities, governance meetings, and it had the benefit of making the association more valuable throughout the year and also allowed people to participate in some of these activities even if they couldn't make it to the conference. So you no longer had to be able to go to the conference to be a leader, to be on a governance committee or something like that. When it came to meeting delivery, we made a number of decisions related to expanding access to in-person meetings as much as possible, including live streaming and recording, and offering remote access for people with disabilities or medical conditions for which a medical professional would advise against in-person attendance. And the rest had to do with modalities and locations. We decided to start offering a virtual meeting every 3 years to increase accessibility, reduce cost, and reduce the carbon impact. We knew from our survey that cost is by far the largest barrier to in-person meeting attendance, and going virtual is the only way to meaningfully mitigate that cost. We also knew that we could decrease our carbon impact by a third, even if we didn't do anything else to address environmental considerations. But we did take one more step. We did an analysis that most organizations could do of the carbon impact of our meeting, and we learned that the estimated carbon footprint of an ASA meeting in Los Angeles is about double that of meetings in Chicago or New York, given where our attendees live. And so we altered our standard regional rotation to align with that information. And finally, we also committed to testing a virtual mini conference to precede in-person annual meetings. So I share all of this just to begin to flesh out, in addition to some of the ideas that were presented earlier in the panel, what this sort of multi-pronged strategy might look like. So some virtual conferences, some in-person conferences, some smaller virtual activities with specific purpose, some recorded events, some distributed conferences, and so on. The presentations from my colleagues today serve to highlight just how important it is for us to be thoughtful about what we're trying to accomplish. As Willem says, what's the objective of the meeting? To be thoughtful about who we're serving and what the options for service might be, and then to take that information and map out options that best serve the most people, all in the interest of navigating diverse viewpoints and needs to optimize the conference experience. So thank you again to my colleagues, and I will turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you, everyone. Now we're going to start the moderated discussion, and I'd love to start by just asking the speakers and our discussant to share any questions or comments you have for your panel members.
Yeah, I just briefly like to bring up that, I didn't mention the ecological concerns with in-person conferences, and it was kind of delightful to hear, Lauren, that of course that's front and center. There were some societies who are hearing from members, depending on their constituency and perhaps either the generation of the members or the discipline that they're in, who are saying, I don't want an in-person conference anymore. Like, that's just gone now because it's too damaging to the environment. So I really appreciated hearing the work you're doing there.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I have a question, I think mainly for Willem. Well, I have a question for Jessica too, but Willem, this is a pretty speculative question. You may just want to ponder it for a while, but have you encountered research, or have you considered, or do virtual meeting formats and modalities, do they offer new avenues for interaction that have been under or unexplored?
That's a very good question, and well, there is research about beyond being there, right? So when could virtual actually beat what is oftentimes considered gold standard of in-person meetings? And there certainly is, and I think in that question, it's very useful to think of maybe especially minority groups. Who might not able again to attend otherwise, but also in the interaction may feel inhibited. I'm not sure, but I'm a non-native English speaker, and so for me to speak up in an in-person meeting might actually be more difficult than to speak up in an online meeting, because I can be a bit more prepared. Maybe I quickly search a word just to make sure, and then I can take the floor, or I can also speak up using a button or the raise hand issue, which is maybe a little bit less obtrusive than intervening in someone's discussion. So it's also because I think meeting practices are a bit different in virtual, where we wait for each other to stop talking before you don't as easily interrupt as you do typically in a face-to-face meeting. And so again, I think the opportunity here is to really think of people that, inclusive, making meetings more inclusive in that sense. But it's kind of ongoing work, which I'm happy to share in another meeting, in another of these conferences, perhaps.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I had this question about, I think for Lauren, about the one-time participant. I'm not sure if I missed it, but could this be about PhD students then, or was it not per se for academia?
So we're still digging into that, and it is surprising and it's not surprising. I think about my own conference going attendance, and I think that there is a lot of people go maybe one time as a student, and then they might not go again. They go or they go often. There's a lot of things that can drive that pattern. For many people, we're hearing that their presentation at a conference, their attendance at a conference, basically 100% hinges on whether they have a grant or funding to support it, and whether that grant or funding requires them to present. The tie between those two factors seems to be very strong. And so and I think about my own history, and that's true. If I was working on a project and it required me to go to a conference, I went, and otherwise I didn't go. There's also, I think, a lot of where people might attend once, see if it's the society for them, and then they may or may not come back. So that revolving door maybe it's certainly plausible, but I think it just gave us, and we're continuing to evaluate that, but it's one of those results where you're like, oh, maybe conferences aren't what I thought they were. And I think in general, the more that we dig into this, and Jessica, I have a question for you that is about that. We find that there are just a lot of assumptions. Like, there seems to be so little quantitative research in what conferences are for, the role that they play in advancing careers, the benefits that they provide. There just seem to be a lot of assumptions about what they are and aren't. And then when you start to sort of dig in a little bit, you find that, what Nancy said, it's all about cost. It's like there's all these other factors, but really it comes down to cost. So I think the more that we can start to tease and unravel and question some of these assumptions and understand what the landscape is that we're dealing with, I think that then you can start to make better recommendations. Did that address your question, Willem? Okay. Well, then Jessica, I'll just dive into it. I'm not sure whether it's maybe something that you may have encountered in our work. We have these professional societies or partners, and we're talking with a lot of professional societies, as many as we have time for. And I think that what we're finding is that, again, one of those assumptions maybe is that people seem to assume that professional societies have like a lot of power and a lot of okay. So I don't know if you can comment on your experience with that, and whether that's, this is our informal finding here. And so I thought that you might have something more specific about that to comment on.
Yeah, are you asking about the perception that they have power, or like their actual sense of powerlessness within the society?
Is that correct, that we have this assumption that they have a lot of power, and then how does that contrast but with actual, like, both things?
Since I primarily spoke to society staff members, I was only hearing it from the other side, and we had a cohort of 17 societies that we worked with over the course of a year, a series of workshops, and actually Nancy was one of the participants in that. We just heard them feeling like they were being pulled apart from all sides in terms of younger scholars don't see our benefit, and they're concerned about the environment, and they're taking, maybe they're sandwich generation, or they're not tenure track and aren't going to get funding from the school. So they were feeling that crunch. It's actually quite relevant as well to something that Lauren was saying about they're feeling like they're not relevant enough to anyone outside of niche academia. This is that's something else they were struggling with. They were not feeling powerful, and they were feeling that some of the older established members, maybe the ones who are financially able to support the society, had very entrenched views of what it meant to have a meeting and to be a society. Goodness. And they were saying that, members of the society think the conference should be free or don't want to pay. They were feeling quite powerless in a lot of ways. Not all. Like Nancy said, they took a lot of initiative in the American Sociological Association to be forward thinking about that and put together a committee to try to reconsider things before the situation got dire. But from the society's perspective, I was hearing lots of confusion and uncertainty, and being kind of at the whims of members.
Yeah, and if I may jump in, I think I might rephrase the question a little bit. So not so much. I think there are a lot of ways in which members think societies are more powerful than they are. I'm not sure if the meetings if the meeting was the main place. What I think, building on what Jessica was just saying, is that members just generally, and this makes a lot of sense, don't know what's behind the curtain with the meetings, right? So there's all sorts of work that goes into planning a conference, right? There's a ton of money that goes into planning a conference. And, members will come with ideas that, if you don't know about all that stuff, really sound great. I mean, they're thoughtful, creative ideas. But when you dig into how you actually would implement them, they might be really not at all feasible, right? And so I think that's where the disconnect is. And I know a lot of the associations are trying hard to communicate with their members about what it means to implement different kinds of models, and why certain ideas aren't feasible for cost or other reasons. I mean, cost is a big one, but there are others as well. And one thing that, I think, Lauren, I was thinking about listening to your recent comment about how we just don't have, there are all these assumptions, right, about conferences, and we don't really have the quantitative data to understand. So like at ASA, I think we have a pretty good understanding. ASA has a pretty good understanding of ASA's meeting and meeting participants, because we did this deep dive, but it wasn't done for broad research purposes about meetings, right? It was done for internal organizational decision-making purposes. And you're broadening this, and Jessica's done some of this work too across 17 societies. So the data is starting to build, but it does seem like maybe there's an opportunity for a large-scale study with sort of consistent, the same kind of survey questions being asked across a wide range of organizations that offer conferences, to better understand the big picture.
Great, thank you. This has been a great discussion. Now I have a couple questions from the audience that I'll introduce now. So our first one is, the audience member asks, what do you suggest we can do to manage generational unwillingness? So we talked about how younger generations are leaning towards the virtual option, but this person is wanting to have you all reflect on generational unwillingness. And she goes on to say, this is a common problem across institutions, where those in leadership positions, might tend to want to stay with a certain paradigm, which could, hamper the ability for, us to adapt to stakeholder needs. Any thoughts on that?
I guess I can jump in. It's not the most, there's a lot of feedback in someone's, oh, is okay. Yeah. So I have an answer, but it's not terribly satisfying one. So we have professional society partners as part of our project, and the feedback that we got from them was that, you know, we have to do this, we have to do the research, and we have to bring quantifiable data to these arguments. And even though they might be, even though some of our ideas, and especially around generations, like generational shift or, you know, changes might be easy to, sorry, this is a hard topic. They said that they, you know, for some of the generational change to happen, we needed to bring, you know, quantifiable evidence that there could be a path that is maybe different, but still works and meets the needs of across these generations. And even though, you know, many younger people might want something different, it has to be sort of demonstrated well that there's going to be a sustainable business there for the society's business. It's maybe not business, but a sustainable revenue, you know, for them to keep the lights on. And also that the perceived needs of the different generations will be met. So yeah, that was part of the advice, was that we have to do we have to do the research, we have to bring the evidence, and we have to show that there's a path forward that will be consistent with the past, but bring us into the future. If that makes sense.
Anyone else have any response?
Yeah, I think it's to some degree. I mean, I'm a sociologist, so my answer will not be surprising. I think that there's a cultural dimension to this question, right? So, you know, there are some people who are kind of set in their ways, right? And it is going to be hard to bring them along in some new and with some new and different approaches. And so it seems like there are a couple possibilities. I mean, that's part of why, you know, I was kind of talking about this idea of having a package of options for different kinds of people. And, you know, when you think about what these variables are that you want to consider, I mean, you know, you can't design a meeting for every individual, right? You have to think about what the most important or impactful variables are. But, you know, one of the things might be a generational kind of consideration. You know, how many people just can't imagine sitting in a meeting like this, right? And designing options for them, which may be in-person options, but also may be specially constructed technological options that are, you know, made extra easy with special. It could be a communication challenge, right? With special instructions. You know, if there's a retirement network or something, you know, that you start with something that's set up for that group, or, you know, there could be many ways to think about it. But again, you know, thinking about it as a cultural issue, and thinking about how to tailor different things to bring in the population that might be resistant to electronic options, maybe something to think about.
Sort of a cheeky response to that, you know, if you're hearing the society saying we need quantitative evidence that this will be financially sustainable to change to some of the models that the younger members prefer, like, I would say, if there aren't more younger members, then you won't need to worry about financial sustainability. So there's that angle as well.
Thank you. I have another question. This one is for Lauren, and others are welcome to chime in as well. Did the size of the conference affect whether the conference goers came back for a second time?
Great. Sorry, I was just typing an answer to that question in the chat. So we did intentionally choose 4 societies that differed in size. And so we haven't been able to address that question yet. But when we, you know, constructed, we did try and choose a range of societies within ecology and conservation, but that differed in both size and also one is an international society and the other ones are more national. So we wanted to try and bring some of that contrast in. That said, I have two things to add to that. We're early in our data analysis, so unfortunately I don't have that answer for you right now, but we did try to bring that into our question. The other thing that we're really trying to do is we're trying to build this data analysis as a pipeline that we can share with other people and other conferences. So basically an analytical, shareable code that you can sort of put your conference data in and get these analyses out. And so we're hoping to eventually create it so that we can bring more society data in easily or share that, code so that other people can do these analyses themselves and to, get into questions like that. So conference size is I think it's really, really important factor. And in our survey, we do include a question about conference size. And then we're trying to bring that in. I think it's a really important factor.
Great. Did anyone else want to add anything? If not, we can move to the next one. Anyone? All right. Our next audience question. So I would like to hear from the panelists about whether their thoughts on recordings of virtual conferences or presentations. They're wondering, do you think, or do you have any data showing that these recordings are being viewed or utilized? Further, does this asynchronous format help building bridges or making the content more accessible? For instance, having a closed caption.
We came up with a prototype that we tested, an idea of, this is related but slightly separate. It was kind of virtual paper presentations, like lightning talks, a platform for that. So we were hearing, again, trying to think of the younger scholars and ways to engage them in the societies. We were hearing, that's first of all a kind of a low-key way to get into presenting, perhaps less intimidating, perhaps less, of a large project is required to present about. And it was interesting how mixed responses to that were. I mean, of course, there are disciplines that don't really rely on papers. There were others who didn't want their work to be publicly viewable like that, either because I don't know, they didn't want to get taken out of context, or they were presenting something that was near completion but not published yet. So I was surprised how vehemently opposed some people were to having their recording shared out. And of course, there were others who thought that was just lovely and I'm going to reach more people and it's accessible anytime, anywhere. So there was a mixed response.
Thank you. Or we have another question. This one's directed to Nancy. Can Nancy speak to how ASA moved to the virtual conferencing every 3 years when hotel or convention center contracts are booked out, often 3 to 4 years? For instance, so did they hold off on contracting and take that risk?
No, we ASA decided to start this the first year after contracts are already signed. So we didn't have to move out of any contracts. That moving, I mean, as I'm sure many of you know, canceling a contract for a large meeting is prohibitively expensive. So that wasn't an option. We had to wait. I think the first ASA had a virtual meeting, of course, 2 virtual meetings during the pandemic, of course, but then I don't remember the year when they're starting, but I think it's 2028 or something like that when the first virtual will go into the rotation because of the contracts that are already in place.
Thank you. We have another question. This person says, as a new conference goer and as someone who has just a little bit of local knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, how could conferences blend and support sharing from varied backgrounds? For instance, much like different societies. So thinking specifically about things like languages, scientific languages, English, non-English.
I want to answer this. Oh, go ahead, Willem. No, you,
No,
please.
I was going to go back to my
Wait.
earlier comment where I feel that I think there's opportunities to make kind of all types of events multimodal, to have multimodalities. So again, it would allow, like we have a bit now, people to talk or people to write. And of course, I think also looping back to one of the previous questions, what is going to be key here, or already is, or in the future is, I think, generative AI that can really help personalize, make the experience for each person as relevant as possible, but also enable them to participate as effectively as possible. So in terms of the recordings, I was thinking of course, what could happen is, watching long recordings, but then if the AI is good at capturing what is relevant to you and your job and your relationships, then it might just give you that, and then you don't have to watch the 1 hour presentation, but just get a 2 minutes insight. And similarly, I think in terms of active participation, this technological developments can play a big role.
Jessica, did you want to share a thought?
Yeah, I'm thinking about, the research about whether people were coming to societies from academia or elsewhere, but it just got me thinking about how many times I got a sense of like, this is exclusivity, that we're serious scholars doing serious work that's not, public. Like, there's almost a reservation that it's not meant to be publicly understandable. If it was, then we're not doing any real, but I imagine that attitude varies whether someone is inside or outside of the academy.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, and where my answer to this question, which is a wonderful question and just really gets at the heart of so many things. So I was also, in this work where we're exploring organizations, like, do you work in a nonprofit? Do you work in a government? Do you, a tribal organization? Like, I think what we're interested in is we think that there are sort of cultural differences between some of these professional networks where conferences just aren't relevant, and we've heard some of that feedback where it's like, yeah, I could go, my nonprofit could send me, but it's just not relevant to my work. And I don't necessarily feel comfortable or valued or, all of those things. So there's all these sort of interplays between, is it relevant to my work? Does it advance my work? And do I feel comfortable there? And there's a lot of, there's a huge amount that we don't even understand about how that is. So to think, but then in my own thinking is that I'm really excited about the opportunity. I think that the pandemic, it gave us enough insights to say conferences of the future don't need to look like the ones of the past. And so let's use this as an opportunity to question, to, some of the work that Willem has talked about, to crack open these assumptions, to think outside of the box a little bit, and to really think about what conferences are for, what Willem said, what is your meeting for? Who do you want to serve that? And then how do you want to serve, how can you best serve them? And I think within that, though, with to the question of how do we engage new or different audiences that have been excluded before, I think that we have to accept that there will have to be some experimentation. We're not going to get it right the first time. If the goal is to include more types of, in our field, if the goal is to have a conference that looks far more diverse organizationally, and a society puts that on with that intention, they're not going to get it right the first time. They're going to have to experiment and understand those constituents and those audiences and play around with what kind of formats and modalities and that kind of thing will work for them, because they haven't been present in the past. I think that, a lot of the work is showing that there just have been a lot of people that have not been present in the past. And so we need to ask them what they want, what works for them, to be inclusive.
Great, thank you. So we have a question directed to Willem. If there are multiple objectives of a conference, or meeting that for instance has conflicting modes that you might suggest, how do you proceed? For example, if networking is important and it would be best accomplished in person, but also getting a specific task done that would be best accomplished virtually, how do we proceed?
Yeah, thanks. That's actually I think a very good question, and again, my research largely is based on the small types of meetings. I think I might have covered already part of the, so I'll get back to what I think tried to explain before, but I did miss a crucial point, which is that if you would say, indeed, here's my objectives, what you should be doing is looking for the most demanding objective and meet it with the capabilities and then also modality of that most demanding objective. So very concretely, if it's routine exchange of information and relationship building, you should go for the high end, or so face-to-face meetings, with the potential that you do have a little bit of a negative in terms of the effectiveness for the one objectives. But usually, as I showed on one slide, there's this positive kind of correlation. So the other alternatives that I tried to explain were to use your modality, your capabilities dynamically, or to split up the meeting and have different meetings. So these are kind of three ways, I think, in which you can handle the situation where you have multiple objectives and trying to meet those as effectively as possible.
Great. We have a couple questions around sort of financial issues, and so I'll kind of try to wrap a few together. So, one question is around, there's been, I think, varying discussions over the course of this workshop around, whether doing virtual or hybrid is cost prohibitive versus, someone suggesting they used a free conference software to provide, the platform for the virtual conference, and just thinking about these different cost benefit ratios. So, for instance, or income streams. So, for instance, we saw that in many cases we're seeing lower registration costs for virtual conferences. Yet, we're also seeing that the reach is oftentimes greater. So we get more participation, and so just wondering if you have different, any numbers regarding, how that might balance out. And, I think this relates also to the question, relating to concerns from, society leadership regarding, the financial models for the different formats.
Right. So I think there's a huge distinction to draw between the cost of a virtual meeting and the cost of a hybrid meeting, because virtual is not expensive. You can do that with Zoom or something, it can be practically free. Hybrid, on the other hand, becomes so expensive because you still have the hotel costs. And I was surprised to hear how large of a percentage of the budget, I don't have the number in front of me, sometimes even like the internet access at the hotel, the conference was. Yeah, I see Nancy's nodding. And hybrid becomes expensive because not only do you have everything happening synchronously in the room, but it has to be broadcast in a way that is interactive both ways, that, people who are watching virtually can ask questions to the speaker on stage. So it becomes very logistically difficult. And I don't know of any free software that was being used for that. So the virtual meetings, I think societies also were really worried when they started to offer the the hybrid option, that it would kind of like cannibalize in-person attendance. And I don't think that's been the case. What else can I say about that? The virtual meeting was just a win financially, like absolutely less expensive, and the costs were more than covered with the lower fees than the in-person conference. But it just goes back to what the two issues of why they can't just adopt virtual is what Willem spoke to about you can't deeply network there. That's not replicable really virtually at this time. And then the more entrenched members who've been in the society for a while who insist on an in-person meeting. So then the society's pulled back into hybrid, which is the highly, highly expensive option. I'm sorry that I don't have more numbers.
Can I jump in with a quick, well, hopefully quick reflection, I guess. We have the same feedback from our society partners that they feel very, very pulled because the cost of hybrid is so high. So this is maybe a question for Nancy. What we encounter sometimes, though, in talking with members or sort of scientists at large, is that they tend to default to saying, yeah, we want hybrid meetings, but then the hybrid meetings that have been held have been very, very poorly attended through virtual attendees. So it's expensive for the societies to put on, and the attendance at hybrid meetings, now that in-person conferences are back, seems to be very low. And in my experience, I wonder if people just want to say hybrid because it's easier for them. But then the actual engagement with hybrid does not seem to be getting traction. That maybe it's just my impression, but it seems to be a difficulty, because if you offer hybrid as an option, everybody seems to go for that, but then the actual engagement is really poor.
I think that, I mean, I can only speak to this anecdotally. I've not organized a hybrid meeting at anywhere, any of the associations where I've been, because it has been, it was moved off the table as a consideration quickly by virtue of the cost. But you know, I've been a member of these large consortiums of associations, so I talk to a lot of executive directors, you know, on a regular basis about their conferences. And my sense from the organizations that have done true hybrids, and there are very few, because I mean, a true hybrid where really there is actual in real time engagement between the people who are in the room and the people who are virtual, it is so expensive. So most associations that say they're doing hybrid, they're not really doing a true hybrid. They're having an in-person meeting and live streaming a session or something like that, right? So if we're really talking about real hybrid, the folks who I've talked to have said people went into it thinking it would be the best of both worlds, and it ended up being the worst of each world. You know, people spent money to come to the conference because they wanted to participate in person, and sat in a room by themselves, talking to themselves when they did a presentation, because the people for the session were virtual. You know, there were a whole bunch of things like that where everybody sort of felt like nobody got a great experience. Again, it's just anecdotal, but I did hear that from, you know, several associations that did experiment with this.
That's helpful. That's kind of clarifying, because it does seem like it was that kind of rosy, it's the best of both, is not seeming to match up with the experiences so far in practical, like in being able to practically carry it off. Thank you.
Yeah, and it seems like you know, there's going to be a learning curve with these, right? The development of the technology and understanding how to do that. And I think we see that even with you know, the virtual offerings, you know, a more, you know, sort of strictly webinar style versus, you know, some of the things that we're trying to do. And even, you know, with this platform, we've, you know, had some, you know, of our, you know, had some challenges and so forth. And, you know, I think related to that, you know, I'm wondering what, you know, if there's any indication that the costs that are being charged for virtual or hybrid options are sort of reflective of the type of offering they're providing. So for instance, you know, if it's, you if they're making the effort to do a sort of full level of engagement with networking or small groups or live posters and that sort of thing, is that cost different than, if they're providing, a live stream option or post-conference recordings, such.
Yeah, I know that in some cases, the cost of access to post-conference recordings was built in, so the cost was higher for that reason. But like Nancy was saying, we were looking at website data for conference pages, and like Nancy said, a lot of them say this is a hybrid conference, and don't, that level of detail isn't available, perhaps unless you even go to it. So I don't have an answer to that.
Well, we're just about reaching our time. I just wanted to give one more opportunity if anyone has any thing that it's been on their mind that they would like to share before we close out. Anyone like to take up that option?
Well, I'll share that I'm.
Go ahead.
Who's going?
Go ahead.
Okay,
Go ahead.
mine's quick. I'm so gratified to see this conference organized, and it's been a pleasure to see it virtually happen and to be. I was dealing with my kids this morning, and then I go to field work tomorrow, and I would have never been able to fit this conference in, if it wasn't virtual. And it's just such a pleasure to be able to connect with people that are inquiring about this around the world. And I'm so gratified that y'all organized this conference. I think it's much needed. I think it's really, really, really needed. We have so much research to do and so much progress to make in this area.
Great. Well, thanks to all of you, the speakers for excellent presentations and our fabulous remarks from our discussant. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for their questions. And so this concludes our panel session on building bridges, navigating diverse viewpoints, and needs to optimize the conference experience. The next set of concurrent sessions will begin at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. In this track 4, the next session will focus on virtual frontiers, transforming conference experiences with immersive technologies. And the other track will be networking, collaboration, and scientific innovation in conferences and meetings. And session 2 for that track will be focused on catalysts of innovation, exploring the impact of scientific convenings on knowledge sharing and idea diffusion. So please join the session of your choice. To navigate, go ahead to the auditorium and select the track you'd like to attend. And thank you all for joining. This concludes the session.